Seeing that the base plates are done now, the next thing to move on to logically would be the main hoop and rear support. Couple things to go over. Number one is going to be rules for the main hoop, and number two is going to be the fitment for the main hoop. So here's a little shot of the rules for the main hoop right now. Now again, it doesn't matter if you're going to be competing or not. Either way, you're still going to be putting the same amount of time into building a roll cage, so you might as well follow a set of rules, because that way it gives you some type of basis on what you should be doing and how you should be going about it, rather than you just building your own thing that never even passes tech anywhere. So of course, just pick your own set of rules that's commonly used. Over here, it's going to be the formula drift rules, so I'm building all this to FD Spec. Now that the rules are covered, number two is going to be the fitment of the main hoop. A big thing to look out for is the fitment of your main hoop to the rest of the car. Okay, so as far as cage fitment, you want your main hoop to fit as closely to the body of the car as you possibly can. So this is the body of the car. That's the roll cage. This is a poor fitting cage where there's quite a bit of distance all around. Number one, you want to protect the driver. If you have your main hoop sitting really close to the driver's head and not tucking up to the body of the car, that's really dangerous for him, because that means there's going to be a metal tube really close to his head, which that's a big issue in a street-driven car where you're not going to be wearing a helmet a lot of the time. Number two, as far as the rigidity of the car, if you're having a big gap over here and you have to cover it with these huge dimple die gussets, which, by the way, not to point any fingers, but a lot of you guys think huge dimple die gussets, it's cool, but it's the opposite. When you see huge dimple die gussets on a main hoop, you know that cage fits horribly. The smaller your dimple die gussets, the better it is, because that means the tighter the cage is fitting. And of course, the tighter it fits, the smaller the gusset. The smaller the gusset is, the stronger it's going to end up being. Also, a lot of times I've seen cages where their main hoop has this huge gap over here, and when you actually look at the driver's head actually ends up sticking out above the main hoop, which, how does that make any sense in a rollover that the driver's head is going to end up hitting before the main hoop starts protecting? Doesn't make any sense. So basically, something to note is when you're making your main hoop, you want to make it tuck up as tight as possible, okay, to the body of your car, where you can still actually fully weld around it. So now that the rules have been covered and the whole fitment issue has been covered, the next thing is going to be covering the templates. So when I'm making my main hoop, I have templates made for everything on my bender. You should do this too. I start all of my bends at a certain point, and so I have, you know, a starting point on each of these things to reference off of. Then I bend them each to a certain degree. So this one's 60, this one's a 30, this one down here is a 45-degree bend. And now I can put these up into my car and actually reference them to see how much of an angle I'm going to need to put into my main hoop in all the different places. And then based off of that, I can take the measurement and I know where to start my bends. So with those templates, I'm going to take them, put them into the car, and then see how wide, see how tall the main hoop needs to be, and see where the bends need to be on the main hoop. The idea behind that is I can come over here with my 60-degree piece, you know, and see how it lines up with the shape of the body, and a 60-degree looks pretty good up here. And so now I can just measure to the center over here and figure out where I need to start my bend, you know, on my die. And so then that way I can get the bend exactly to match up with how I want it to sit over here, which is about 3 feet here. Then with those measurements taken, I can then transfer it to the actual big piece of tubing that I'm going to be using for the main hoop and get started on bending it. Just going to mark the halfway point. Okay, so I measured approximately 3 feet across until I wanted the bend to start, and the bend to start is over here, mark right there. That's where I can go ahead and put that into my die and get the bend I want. Okay, this is a JD squared 4.5-inch radius die, 180-degree bend. That is the tightest radius that you can get with this roll cage material. Also in the FD Tech book, there is a regulation that your radius cannot be less than 3 times your tubing diameter. My tubing diameter is 1.5 inch. 1.5 times 3 is 4.5 inch. So you can't go below a 4.5 inch radius. This is a 4.5 inch radius die. And so the reason that you get the smallest you can, essentially, for doing roll cages is so you can have the tightest fitment cage possible. You don't want to get a 5.5 inch or a 6.5 inch die, because you know what I mean, your hoops are going to just be so ridiculously big. So over here, it just has to line up with the mark. That's where I start all my dies, and that's how I know where all the bends go, and you know, the approximation for everything. So based off of that, now I can bend this tube. Alright, right now it's about 56 degrees. What I'm going to do is take it out and then check it inside the car for fitment. So for the first bend on the tube, I did it less than what I actually needed, and the reason behind that is I can always go back and bend the tubing more, but you can't go back and undo your bend. So if you're not really sure about what bend you want to do, if it's going to be a 60 or 55, go with the 55 first and then bump it up to a 60 later on after you see you need to make it a tighter angle. Oh yeah, beautiful, beautiful. How am I supposed to freaking test fit this, huh?
Looks about right, Jimmy.
Moving on to the second bend on the main hoop, I have to make sure that the tube is actually all leveled out and on the same plane. If your main hoop is rotated and you begin your second bend, you're going to end up with the legs of your main hoop going off in two different directions. So you have to make sure everything is on the same plane. Now, what I just recently found out after building the whole entire roll cage is that they actually sell rotation gauges, and these can clamp onto your tube. You zero it out, you can do your first bend, and then you can, and now you know that it's zero when doing your first bend, you can go do your second bend and zero it out again with the rotation gauge, so you know that it's all in the same plane. I didn't do that, however, so the method I used was just using a piece of wood over the two different areas across the bend, and using my angle finder and getting the angle over there, making sure that it was the same angle that I was getting across my die, and I kind of do it that way. So two ways to do it, although I recommend getting a rotation gauge. Tube bender workout part 2. So honestly, I ended up making the main hoop 3 different times. So each piece is 10 foot, and my average price is usually $2.70 a foot. So about $27 for each main hoop that I make. That means I'm just under $90 for making 3 different main hoops. Now, to me, it's a lot better to make 3 different main hoops and get the fitment perfect and get it exactly how you want it to, rather than just making it one time to save yourself about $60. Now that's a big difference too with a lot of shops, because shops are out there, they're to maximize their profit and to take as little time as possible doing something. So are they going to go back there and do your main hoop 3 times in order to get the best fitting cage possible? Probably not. No, what they're going to do is they're going to cut it and make your gap super big, so that way they know it fits and they can do it in one try, and they can do it with one piece of hoop, save themselves $60 and a few hours of work, but then they're going to give you a subpar product, which is a lot of time, again, I like doing it myself because I know I can take that extra $60 and make a few different main hoops and get my fitment on point. Again, something that you should do as well. Well, I'm not saying you have to do it, but it's probably good practice.
That's it.
Here. When I finally had the 2 top bends in place, I then moved on to doing the 2 lower bends. I estimated once again using the templates, transferred those to the main hoop, and then did my 2 lower bends. Alright, so with the help of a friend, we're fitting up the top of the cage, and I'm just using my 30-degree template to see where to put that bend at. So it's looking like about right here is going to be okay, and give us the room that we need to weld around the bottom. That's the clearance on the top. It's going to be super tight. So 9 5/16. So now you can see this was without the bend over here. This was with the bend. This is just a 25-degree bend. I want to total it to 30, but we just put 25 just so we can see how everything lines up. Maybe we'll add in more degrees over here. See how it goes. Yep. Okay, so basically here's the main hoop now. This has a 25-degree bend on it. The top has a 60. And so this is kind of the fitment we're getting, and now we kind of just need to adjust the bends accordingly and then trim off the bottoms and get it to fit. Okay, so now just put in, after the 28-degree bends over here, there's 60s at the top. This is what we're looking at. Now just a matter of trimming the bottom to size, and then slowly inching it back to where we want it, and then tacking it in place. That covered making the main hoop, and the next thing is to make the rear supports. Here are the rules for the rear supports. Okay, so for the rear support, how I got the angle on how to do this notch right here was, all I did was mock it up to where my base plate was at. So I have my main hoop in place where I wanted it, and then I have, of course, my base plate where it's going to be at. And then I kind of just took a marker right here, and you can just draw straight up. And that's how I found a rough angle for what my notch needed to be at down here. So then with that, I have a line drawn here, and that's where going to be where my cut needs to be and the rough angle that it needs to be at. That took care of the bottom notch on the rear support that goes to the base plate. Next up was to notch the top of the rear support that goes to the actual main hoop. What is this? Now what I use for all of my notching is a website called Metal Geek. I'll show you that right now. But basically that's going to give you your template on how you need to notch it, and you can just notch that with your basic angle grinder with a cutoff disc as well as a flap disc on there. That I've used tube notchers before. I've used the whole hand drawing method of notching it, and then I've used the Metal Geek's method. And Metal Geek is honestly the cheapest and best way to do it, because when you have a 7-foot side hoop that you got to notch, it doesn't matter if you have a $300 notcher. You trying to line up a 7-foot long piece of metal into a tube notcher mounted to a bench and then try and get a notch on there is not happening. You actually having the template and you being able to butt it up against the joint and get the perfect rotation on it, that's what's going to count. So I highly recommend using Metal Geek, cutting out the templates and using those for your actual notching. Okay, so here I got my computer, right? And so this is how I'm going to do the notch. So you just go to this website, metalgeek.com/static/cope.pcgi, I guess. The link is going to be in the description for it. So all you do is just enter the diameter of the cut tube, which is 1.5 inch, the wall thickness, which mine is 0.095, the diameter tube number 2, which is 1.5 inch as well, and then the angle of it. 90 degree would just be your standard angle. Mine's going to be a little bit offset just because the base plates are at an angle, so I'm going to do an 85 degree angle for it, and then you kind of just hit calculate, and then it gives you your pattern right here, and you can just click PDF, right, and then you just control P that, and then oh yeah, so when it says fit to page, don't fit it to page, because if you do, it's going to end up coming out smaller than what it should. So yeah, then all you do is just print that, and then you got your template. You just cut out and wrap around the tube. So here's the template, print it out on a piece of paper, take scissors, and then I'm going to cut it out. Now that you have your template cut out, what you do is you wrap it around the end of your tube, and you just line up the edges, which would line up right there, and you tape them together, and there you have your notch that you need to do. So really the hard part is just lining it up how you want, and then after that it's kind of pretty easy. You just hit it with an angle grinder with a flap disc. So I'm going to take my rear support right here, I'm going to put it up to the rear base plate, make sure the notch is flat. I'm going to push this against my main hoop. I can basically eyeball where this is going to roughly be at, and then based on that, that's where I get to tape up my template and then cut it out for this notch. Now what I like to do on these templates is actually start out kind of high, and that way it gives me some room for error, so I can keep trimming it back and adjusting how this template fits on there, so I can actually get it to a perfect fit. So I continue doing that until I get the notch in the tube to fit right. Once everything is checked, I can then prep the tubes by removing the mill scale as well as beveling all the edges. Another thing that I'll do as well to prep is I'll take a piece of cloth and I'll shove it into the tubing and actually run it down with a broomstick or a smaller tubing in order to clear out all the debris in here. That's another thing that a lot of shops don't do, and that's actually going to make up quite a bit of weight by the time you do your entire roll cage. Not only that, but these are pieces of metal that are in here, and so depending on how big the chunks are, if you actually weld everything in place, by the time you start driving it, you might get a little bit of tingling sounds everywhere, because you're going to have little pieces of metal that are in here because some shop didn't actually clean all their tubes before welding them in place. All right, but once everything is actually prepped, then I can mock it up in the car and tack weld everything in place. And of course, we're just tack welding for right now. Everything will be fully welded once all the rest of the pieces are in the cage, just in case anything needs to be redone or have adjustments made to it. Dude. Hey, look at it from here, though. Look at it from here. Look at it. Damn! Okay, so as you can see, we have the main hoop tacked into place. Rear support tacked in. Rear support tacked in there. Okay, notice the spacing, right, where the main hoop is at. If you look over on the opposite side, the spacing is off. Now, that's just because when you bend material, especially when you're using just a bench like that, it's really hard to get all the bends super even. I try and get them as even as possible, but they end up just being like maybe a degree or two off, and that's gonna cause your leg to come down in a different area. What we're gonna do is we're going to weld the rear support in the same exact spot back here. We're gonna weld it to the same exact spot up there, and then that leg is gonna be just a little bit uneven on the base. And then what we're gonna do is once the top is welded in, we're basically just gonna pull it forward and then tack it in place. So this way we're gonna end up having a perfect cage fitment, even though the cage is just naturally not bent like 100% level, because that's just like a challenge in and of itself.
Go. Go for two.
Can you let go? There we go.
Okay, cage is done.
Cage is done. Cage is done.
Wrap it up.
Built.
Built my butt.
Hashtag forged. Hashtag BC. Brian Crowler, Stroker.
Cage is done.
Cage is done. Yeah, the cage is actually done, so you can see how the main hoop came out. So you can see how tight it tucks up and how much headroom it gives and how high it tucks up, that the driver's head is not affected by this at all. And actually, there's about a 1 finger gap to the roof over here, not even. Over here it gets to like half a finger, in the center it's about a finger. Notice the angle matches the arc of the car right here. This comes down right around there, which is gonna give me enough room to weld. I could have come out farther, but then the thing is I don't get enough room to weld down there, so that's as far as I could make it come out. And I purposely had my bend a little bit higher too, because if you imagine this, if I would have had my bend here, this tube would have come cutting across like so and would have taken away more room from the driver's head. So I purposely made my bend a little bit higher, right where I wanted to weld, match the line of the roof, maximize as much headroom as I possibly could for the driver. So I want to show you how closely that thing tucks up and goes behind. Another thing to look at is how far I pushed it back, and I pushed it back as far as I possibly could, so that way I can give myself as much headroom as I could, again, because I'm a tall person, so I wanted this main hoop basically behind me, right, rather than a lot of people that have it like right over top of my head, which I don't want that because I can hit my head on it. Something you're not going to be able to see that well, but here's my rear support, here's my main hoop, and I tucked this thing up so hard that I can actually weld my rear support to the roof structure itself, so that's going to make for an extremely strong cage. The fact that this cage can't move back any, because it's actually going to hit the structure of the roof. So like I said, that's going to make for an extremely strong cage, and you can tell how little gap too I have along the side. It's not going to be some super huge dimple dies, they're going to be super small. I just gave myself barely enough room to weld. That's all I did. Maximized it as tight as I could possibly make it. You can see again how much headroom I got, and this right now actually needs to go to a lower seat mount, so there's going to be a lot more headroom too. So again, big emphasis on tucking up the cage, having nice fitment, because that's what's going to separate a cheap cage from a good cage, the welds, the overall thought process of it, and of course how hard it tucks. with that exact main hoop, these are the dimensions for it. It's going to be 11.5 inches from the center is where it's going to be the start of this 60-degree bend. Then after that 60-degree bend, it's going to be 9 5/16 inch down for the start of this 28-degree bend. And that's basically it. And then just trim the bottom to fit. And yes. And on that chart, when I say start of the bend, I mean at this mark right here. So 11.5 inches from the center until this point, and then that bend starts. There you go. So in case you're lazy and you don't want to do your own work, you just want to copy mine, that's how you do it. And ta-da, that's it for the main hoop and rear supports. That covers that. So the next thing we're going to be covering is the side hoops. If you have any questions, just let me know in the comments below. I'll try and answer them to the best of my ability. There's actually a lot of thinking that goes into these things. So if you have any questions about how I did stuff, then yeah, just ask below. Bro, like look. So yeah, looks like a roll cage to me.